Hey everyone! Tonight, we're drifting back to a time when night actually meant darkness. The kind of darkness that pressed in on you, soft but suffocating, the way a heavy blanket traps both warmth and worry. So, get comfortable. Let the modern hum of your devices fade into the background. Because we're about to wander through a world that ended, quite abruptly, every time the sun went down. Before electricity, night wasn't something you stayed up through. It was something you survived. The moment twilight spread across the sky, people hurried to finish their business, lock their doors, and light whatever flickering little flame they could afford. And if you couldn't afford one, well, you just went to bed. Not for rest, exactly, but because there was literally nothing else to do. It's strange to think about, isn't it? The modern night is alive, buzzing street lamps, glowing screens, the neighbor's dog barking at a reflection. But a few hundred years ago, once the sun dipped below the horizon, the world turned into something quiet and vaguely menacing. Shadows moved on their own. Wind whistled through cracks in the timber walls. And, if you were unlucky, something else might be moving out there too. Naturally, most people didn't take chances. They believed the night belonged to other things: ghosts, spirits, thieves, disease, and the occasional very confused pig wandering through town. In cities, you might find a few oil lamps or tallow candles glowing faintly in the windows of taverns. But in the countryside, the dark was nearly absolute. You could step outside and lose sight of your own hand. That's not poetic exaggeration. People genuinely got lost in their own yards. More than one poor soul wandered out to relieve themselves after supper and never came back. Sometimes they fell into wells. Sometimes they froze. Sometimes they just kept walking until morning, dazed and directionless, like sleepwalkers in a sea of black. And so, for centuries, the night was treated with suspicion. It was when the respectable went inside, and the disreputable came out. If you were a guard, a watchman, or worse, a doctor, you were one of the unlucky few who had to confront what the dark hid. Let's start with a picture. It's 14th century London. The day has ended, and the city's watch begins their rounds. They carry lanterns so dim they might as well be decorative. The streets smell of ash and something unpleasantly alive. Every few steps, there's a splash in the mud, sometimes water, sometimes not. You might hear a door creak open as someone slips out for reasons that never needed explaining. And overhead, the stars glimmer through a haze of wood smoke and unwashed humanity. The watchmen call out the hour, 10 o'clock and all's well, which was mostly wishful thinking. They did it to assure people inside that life still existed out there. But also to remind anyone lurking that someone, technically, was on duty. If you think of them as early versions of streetlights, you wouldn't be wrong: loud, occasionally drunk, and mostly decorative. Meanwhile, inside the homes of the slightly wealthy, things weren't much brighter. Candles were expensive. Oil lamps were finicky. And the flame from a hearth only stretched so far. People tended to cluster in the glow of a single fire, the rest of the room sinking into murk. Shadows danced across the walls like slow-moving thoughts. Most homes had only a few candles per night, and each one burned precious resources. So, every flicker was monitored. Servants were scolded for letting candles gutter. Children were told terrifying stories about spirits that snuffed out flames. It worked surprisingly well as motivation to be careful. In rural villages, people practiced something called segmented sleep. They'd go to bed soon after dark, wake up around midnight for an hour or two, and then go back to sleep until dawn. During that wakeful middle stretch, they might pray, whisper to one another, or even visit neighbors quietly. Imagine that, tiptoeing across fields at 1 in the morning, guided by moonlight and a vague sense of who might still be awake. It wasn't insomnia. It was just how life worked when the world gave you nothing but darkness and silence. And that darkness was never still. Nocturnal animals, thieves, and the occasional wandering drunk made enough noise to remind everyone that danger was nearby. People believed in night air, or miasma, that the darkness itself could make you sick. So windows were kept shut, which helped no one's lungs. Rooms filled with the smell of smoke and sweat. But at least the evil air stayed outside. Probably. Night was also when fires started most easily. Because of course they did. A single overturned candle could turn a street into ashes. Whole cities burned down this way. London, Amsterdam, Paris, none of them strangers to a fire that began with someone trying to see in the dark. And once the flames caught, there was no fire brigade coming. Just neighbors, buckets, and panic. For those too poor to keep candles or hearths burning, darkness was total. They lived by instinct. They memorized the layout of their homes, the cracks in the wall, the slope of the floorboards, so they could move around without light. Sometimes, they sang to themselves quietly, both to calm their nerves and to make sure nothing else was moving in the room. If you've ever felt uneasy walking through your house at night, imagine that same feeling magnified by 1,000. Because when something brushed against your leg back then, it wasn't a cat, it was probably a rat. And not the kind you find cute in children's movies. These were plague-carrying, bread-stealing monsters the size of a slipper. Speaking of the plague, darkness didn't help with that either. When sickness came, it hit hardest at night. That's when fevers spiked and prayers grew hoarse. Doctors made house calls carrying lanterns and masks that looked like the result of a bad bird costume. If you saw one of them coming, you knew things were about to go badly. But it wasn't all terror and superstition. Night also held strange beauty. Writers spoke of moonlight as if it were another world, calmer, gentler, secretive. Lovers met in gardens. Poets wrote by the flicker of oil lamps, romanticizing the same darkness that terrified everyone else. Somehow, humanity always finds a way to make misery sound poetic. The wealthy turned their fear of darkness into rituals. They employed night men to patrol their estates and chase away anyone suspicious. Of course, the night men were often the suspicious ones. Drunk, bored, and armed with cudgels. They'd occasionally arrest each other by mistake. Paperwork was not their strength. In castles, things got weirder. Servants carried torches down endless corridors that acted like wind tunnels. Every flame was a hazard waiting to happen. Tapestries caught fire. Curtains smoldered. And yet, nobles insisted on sleeping surrounded by them. Because who doesn't love a flammable bedchamber? Some royals even used special candle shades made of silver or glass. They reflected the light outward, making it look brighter. But they also made the wax melt faster, which meant more candles. So luxury became self-defeating, as it often does. And then there was the sound of a pre-electric night. No engines, no hum of refrigerators, no far-off traffic. Just the occasional hoot of an owl, the bark of a dog, or the creak of a house settling into the cold. The kind of quiet that makes you hear your own heartbeat and wonder if something else might be listening too. Let's drift, for a moment, to the countryside. A small farmhouse, 1700s England. The family's gone to bed. The only light comes from a banked fire, red and low. Outside, the world is pitch black. But somewhere out there, something moves, a horse maybe, or a thief, or just the wind. Inside, everyone lies awake for a moment, listening. And then, one by one, they surrender to sleep, because the dark is endless and you might as well rest. It's easy to forget that artificial light changed not just how people saw, but how they lived. Before it, night dictated everything: work, meals, safety, even birth and death. Most babies were born at night, by the light of a single candle. Most crimes happened then, too. You can't arrest what you can't see. And that was a convenient excuse for many things. When we think of nightlife today, we imagine music and neon. Back then, nightlife meant rats, sickness, and sometimes church bells ringing for the recently deceased. Because, of course, they had to bury people quickly, and night was as good a time as any. Cities tried to fight back against the dark. Paris was one of the first to introduce organized street lighting in the 1600s. Oil lamps hung from hooks at regular intervals, giving the illusion of safety. But they had to be lit by hand every evening. Dozens of lamplighters would walk the streets at dusk, using long poles with tiny flames. And then, at dawn, they'd come back to snuff them out again. A tedious job, but at least it came with exercise. Still, those lamps barely dented the darkness. Criminals adapted immediately. Robbers learned to avoid the lit areas, or better yet, to pose as lamplighters themselves. Mugging someone under the comforting glow of a public lantern had a certain irony. Meanwhile, back in the homes of the ordinary folk, bedtime became ritualistic. Candles extinguished, fires banked, doors barred. People recited prayers, not for spiritual comfort but for survival. One common one went something like, "From fire, from thieves, and from nightmares, deliver us, O Lord." A practical list, really. And nightmares, well, they were an entire event. Without electric light to chase them away, dreams took on the weight of real things. People genuinely believed that evil spirits visited sleepers. To ward them off, some placed iron nails in the corners of their rooms. Others hung herbs or, for reasons that defy logic, pieces of bread. No one wanted to go hungry, even the supernatural. And if you did wake from a nightmare, there wasn't much you could do. You couldn't just turn on a light, check your phone, and scroll away the fear. You sat there in the dark, heart pounding, staring at the vague shapes around your bed until dawn arrived like a slow apology. Of course, every society had its own take on what the night meant. In medieval Europe, it was demonic. In ancient China, it was spiritual, filled with wandering ancestors. In Japan, yokai and other night creatures roamed the roads, which sounds terrifying but at least creative. And everywhere, the darkness carried the same undertone of unease. The unknown was always worse when you couldn't see it. Let's drift for a moment into those upper rooms where scholars worked late into the night. Candles burning, quills scratching, eyes red and half mad from the effort. They called it burning the midnight oil, but really it was just burning themselves out. Many of them went blind early, too much staring at tiny letters in flickering light. And yet, they kept going, because knowledge, apparently, was worth a lifetime of squinting. But not everyone was so dedicated. Most people gave up trying to read or write after dark. It just wasn't practical. Instead, they told stories. Fireside tales of ghosts, saints, and unlucky travelers who ignored the sunset and paid for it. These stories passed down through generations, growing darker each time. Because fear was the only thing that stayed consistent in the dark. It's funny how the night, now so calm and familiar to us, used to hold such power. We flood it with light, so much that we've forgotten what it felt like. But for most of human history, night was a living thing. It breathed. It hid. It punished carelessness and rewarded caution. You respected it, or you didn't wake up. So tonight, as you lie there, listening to the quiet hum of your room, imagine what it would feel like if the power went out, completely, and stayed out. No streetlights. No fridge hum. No faint blue glow under your door. Just the dark, returning to claim what it once owned. Would you sleep easily? Or would you, like them, sit awake for a while, listening for footsteps that probably aren't there? Tell me in the comments, what's the first thing you'd miss if the world went dark again? Let's drift onward, deeper into the history of the night. Because, as it turns out, the danger wasn't just what lurked outside. It was also what we did to ourselves in the dark. Let's drift onward, shall we? The sun has set again, the world gone quiet, and humanity, stubborn as ever, has decided that it deserves a little more light than nature was willing to give. And so begins one of history's longest, most frustrating quests. The search for a way to see after sunset. You might think the solution was simple, just light something on fire. And that's true, in a way. But the trouble was keeping that fire controlled, bright, and ideally not setting the curtains, your beard, or your neighbor's roof on fire in the process. Because, as we'll see, people were endlessly inventive in the worst possible ways. Before electricity, light was labor. It was time, money, and danger wrapped into one tiny flickering flame. You didn't just turn it on, you made it. Every candle, every lamp, every glow came at a cost. And most of the time, that cost was more than people could really afford. Let's start with the humble candle. It sounds so peaceful now, doesn't it? You imagine warm light, cozy corners, maybe a book. But the reality was, well, greasier. The earliest European candles were made of tallow, which is a polite word for beef or mutton fat. You melted it down, poured it into a mold with a bit of twisted flax for a wick, and waited. And the result was, to put it kindly, disgusting. Tallow candles smelled like rancid meat when burned. They smoked thickly. They dripped. They stuck to your fingers if you touched them too soon. And if you were rich enough to afford dozens of them, congratulations. You now lived in a house that smelled faintly of old stew and regret. Beeswax candles were better, of course. They burned cleanly and gave off a pleasant honey scent. Naturally, they were reserved for churches and the nobility. Everyone else got the animal fat edition. Even monasteries rationed their beeswax carefully, saving the best for feast days and dignitaries. Apparently, God appreciated nice lighting. In the 1600s, an English household might spend a tenth of its annual income just on lighting materials. So when people talk about burning the candle at both ends, they mean that quite literally. It was a scandalous waste of money. Light was a luxury, and too much of it looked suspiciously sinful. And then there were oil lamps, those delicate glass or metal things that appear so serene in old paintings. In practice, they were a nightmare. They leaked, they smoked, and they attracted insects like unpaid rent collectors. Oil was expensive too, especially whale oil, which for a time became the height of enlightenment, literally. Every city wanted it, every merchant wanted to sell it, and every whale, understandably, wanted to avoid it. Whale oil came mostly from sperm whales, whose head cavities were conveniently full of a clear, slow-burning substance. Sailors risked months at sea to bring it back. The irony, of course, is that to light the night, humans went to war with creatures that actually lived in the dark. But it worked. Whale oil burned longer and brighter than tallow, and for a brief, shiny moment, it made the world seem conquerable. Until it didn't. Because nothing says civilization like burning through entire animal species for a better reading light. By the mid-1800s, whales were being hunted to near extinction. And people began to wonder if there might be a less bio-destructive way to avoid tripping over the furniture. Enter coal gas. Or as it was known then, town gas. If you ever want to appreciate modern electricity, spend 5 minutes reading about early gaslighting. It was, by all accounts, the least safe innovation imaginable. In the late 18th century, inventors discovered that by heating coal in sealed ovens, they could produce a flammable gas that could be piped through metal tubes and ignited for light. This was considered a good idea. At least until the pipes leaked, which they often did, filling homes with invisible clouds of explosive potential. But before we get to that, let's pause on the fact that people willingly invited flammable gas into their bedrooms. And they did it happily. When gas lighting first came to London, it was treated like magic. Crowds gathered in the streets to marvel at the new glow. Theaters were the first to adopt it, because of course they were. If there was even a 10% chance of an explosion, it belonged on stage. Actors basked under harsh, hissing flames, sweating profusely while audiences oohed and awed at the novelty. The air grew thick, the smell unbearable, but it was progress. Dangerous, smoky progress. Meanwhile, in homes, gas lighting began to replace oil lamps. The flick of a valve, the touch of a flame, and there it was, light. No dripping wax, no soot-covered glass. Just the constant hiss of burning gas and the lingering thought that, yes, the ceiling might ignite at any moment. In those early days, houses didn't yet have proper ventilation for gas. Rooms filled with carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide. Some people woke with headaches. Some didn't wake at all. Naturally, nobody thought the gas might be to blame. They blamed bad air or the ever-popular night vapors. It was an age before accountability. But before gas, and long before anyone thought to run pipes through their walls, people had to rely on more primitive methods. Pine torches were common in Scandinavia. They burned brightly and quickly. And they also spat embers everywhere, which made wooden homes feel like ticking time bombs. In Japan, oil lamps called andon used cotton wicks inside paper or silk shades. Beautiful, delicate, and, predictably, flammable. The world had an unfortunate habit of burning down its own inventions. Firelight itself had an entire etiquette. In noble homes, servants were trained in how to tend candles correctly. Wicks had to be trimmed with special scissors called snuffers, which collected the burnt ends so they wouldn't fall into the wax. This wasn't just to keep things tidy, it was to keep people alive. Because if you trimmed a candle wrong, the wick could mushroom, producing smoke and sparks. And if that spark hit a tapestry or a wooden beam, well, there went the West Wing. People genuinely feared the dark, but they feared fire even more. It was a cruel balance. Too little light, and you might walk into a wall or an open sewer. Too much light, and you might burn down your entire street. One of my favorite historical contradictions is that medieval Europeans believed fire had a moral quality. It was pure, sacred, even cleansing. And yet they spent half their lives terrified of it. A bit like how we think of the internet now, necessary but vaguely threatening. In the wealthiest homes, chandeliers filled with candles glittered like tiny suns. Each one was a statement, "Look how much money I can afford to literally set on fire." Servants climbed ladders daily to replace candles, polish crystal, and scrape away soot. They must have hated every minute of it. But for guests, it looked heavenly. Soft golden light bouncing off mirrors, silk, and silver. The illusion of safety, purchased one candle at a time. Churches, of course, took lighting to divine extremes. Massive candelabras glowed before the altar. Monks kept votive candles burning day and night. If a flame went out unexpectedly, it was considered an omen. Someone would be blamed, usually a novice who wasn't even in the room. Spiritual symbolism aside, all that open flame made churches some of the most fire-prone buildings in Europe. God's house, it turned out, needed very good insurance. And let's not forget how lighting shaped human behavior. Because the moment you add even a little illumination, people get ideas. Markets extended their hours. Taverns stayed open later. Crime followed soon after. The night grew busier, noisier, and just a little more complicated. In the 1600s, when Paris first installed public lanterns, citizens were overjoyed. Finally, they could walk the streets safely at night, at least in theory. Each lantern hung from an iron bracket, tended by a lamplighter. The lamplighters became local celebrities, seen as guardians of the night. In practice, they were more like glorified matchsticks. If it rained, their work was pointless. If it was windy, dangerous. And if someone wanted to rob you, the lamplighter was probably already on break. The glow of those first lamps was faint, but revolutionary. For the first time, cities didn't vanish completely after dusk. Shops stayed open. Couriers moved at night. Even lovers could take strolls without tripping over every cobblestone. It was a small, stubborn victory against the tyranny of darkness. But it didn't come without side effects. The new light revealed things best left unseen: dirty streets, beggars, and the odd corpse no one had noticed before. There was a moral panic, too. Religious leaders claimed that lighting the night was an offense to God, who clearly intended people to sleep. Which was a strange complaint coming from a faith that burned thousands of candles a day in his name. Hypocrisy burns brightest, it seems. Of course, these little lamps had to be lit by hand each evening. There was no master switch, no automation. Just dozens of tired men walking from post to post, touching flame to wick. Imagine being the last lamplighter on a foggy London night. Your job isn't over until you've walked the entire route. Your hands black with soot, your eyes half blind from glare. And all the while, shadows move just beyond the edge of your light. People told stories about them, the lamplighters who vanished, swallowed by the fog, their lanterns found still burning on the cobblestones. Romantics loved that kind of thing. Everyone else just double-locked their doors. And even when things went well, those oil lamps still filled the air with soot and odor. They blackened ceilings. They made paintings grimy. And over time, people began to notice that their furniture, especially in candlelit rooms, was covered in a fine, sticky film. That was the residue of centuries of attempted enlightenment. Then came new fuels. Campine, a mixture of turpentine and alcohol, was one of the 19th century's brightest mistakes. It burned brilliantly, and exploded frequently. People used it anyway, because it was cheap and effective, right up until it wasn't. Each generation seemed determined to make lighting slightly more efficient and significantly more lethal. And yet, no one wanted to go back to the dark. Once you've seen the night lit, you can't unsee it. It wasn't until the late 19th century that kerosene lamps finally struck a balance between brightness and danger. They were portable, reliable, and didn't require sacrificing whales or sanity. But even kerosene had its moments. Homes went up in flames with alarming regularity. And if you dropped one, the floor became a sheet of fire faster than you could say, insurance claim. Still, the appeal was undeniable. The gentle hiss of the flame. The faint smell of oil. The small circle of light in an ocean of black. There's something beautifully human about that image. Desperate, resourceful, and slightly doomed. In wealthy homes, the arrival of gaslighting and later kerosene marked a new kind of evening life. People stayed awake longer. Dinner parties stretched past midnight. Fashion adjusted. Even morality, in its own way, dimmed. The night was no longer a boundary. It was an invitation. The poor, of course, didn't benefit quite as much. They still rationed light. Children did their homework by the embers of a dying fire. Women sewed by moonlight. And men drank by whatever was left of the tavern candle. It wasn't romantic, it was necessity disguised as thrift. But perhaps the saddest irony of all is that even as we learned to light the dark, we also lost something. The sky. Because with every new lamp, every new glowing window, the stars faded. What once guided sailors, poets, and wanderers vanished into haze. Progress, as usual, came with a quiet apology. So tonight, as you sit under your electric bulb, maybe look up for a moment. Imagine those early lamps sputtering against the void, tiny human efforts to keep the dark at bay. And think, would you have braved the gas, the fumes, the fire, just to see a little longer? Or would you have let night take over, as it always used to? Tell me in the comments. What would you have used to light your home? A candle, an oil lamp, or a faint hope that the moon would be enough? Let's drift onward. Because light changed more than our evenings, it changed our bodies. And as we'll see next, when we started tampering with the night, our sleep, and our sanity were never quite the same again. Let's drift a little deeper now. The lamps are burning low, the air smells faintly of smoke and old wood, and the world has finally gone quiet again. Before electricity, night wasn't just something people saw differently, it was something they lived differently. Because when the sun dictated your hours, sleep had a mind of its own. We think of sleep now as a single, neat stretch, a block of 7 or 8 hours, give or take a doom scroll. But for most of human history, that's not how it worked. People didn't go to bed once and wake up once. They slept twice. This was called segmented sleep, or sometimes first and second sleep. And it was as ordinary as breakfast. You'd fall asleep shortly after sunset, wake up sometime after midnight, and then do something. Pray, talk, think, eat, occasionally visit the neighbors, before drifting off again until dawn. It sounds strange now, but it fit perfectly with the rhythm of life before artificial light. Darkness came early, and it stayed. The night stretched long and heavy, so the human brain made peace with that by dividing it up. The first sleep was deep, physical, restorative. The second was lighter, filled with dreams and the kind of half-conscious thoughts that feel profound until morning proves otherwise. We know about it not from imagination, but from evidence. Letters, diaries, even legal records. People would mention it casually, as if everyone knew what they meant. One Englishman in the 1600s wrote that after his first sleep, he rose to smoke tobacco and converse with God. Which, honestly, sounds like the most 17th-century sentence ever written. Others used the time for less pious activities. Married couples, especially, found the midnight gap convenient. One French medical guide from 1550 even recommended it for conception, claiming that after the first sleep, the body was well rested and the spirits warm. Apparently, candlelight wasn't the only thing being reignited. But it wasn't all prayer and romance. Sometimes people used the hours to worry. To sit by the dying fire and think about the harvest, or the taxes, or the noise that might have been the wind. Midnight had a reputation, not quite evil, but certainly uncanny. The hours between sleeps were liminal, belonging to neither day nor night, where rules softened and imaginations sharpened. In cities, the watchman's calls marked the passing of those uneasy hours. They'd shout, 1 o'clock and all's well, which usually meant that it wasn't. For people lying awake in bed, the voice was a comfort, proof that someone was still awake out there, keeping an eye on the darkness. And maybe on them, too. Sleep itself was understood differently. People didn't see it as a simple biological need, but as a spiritual or even moral state. To sleep too long was laziness. To sleep too little, prideful. There was always a sermon ready to remind you that God disapproved of both extremes. Doctors of the day, the same ones who believed leeches had strong opinions about your health, had firm ideas about sleep as well. They advised sleeping on your right side, because lying on the left was thought to heat the liver, which apparently led to sinful dreams. And if you woke too often, they suggested wrapping your head in cabbage leaves soaked in vinegar. There's no evidence it worked, but at least it kept people too distracted to think about the noise outside. Dreams, of course, carried great importance. Without electric light to break up the night, dreaming was a form of entertainment, prophecy, and sometimes diagnosis. People believed that the soul wandered during sleep, slipping out, exploring, collecting messages from God, or occasionally from less reputable sources. If you dreamed of falling, it meant pride. If you dreamed of teeth, it meant death. If you dreamed of cheese, apparently that meant nothing, except that you'd probably eaten too much cheese. Monks and mystics saw dreams as divine communication. Peasants saw them as gossip from the beyond. And doctors, again proving their creativity, thought they were caused by bad digestion. Which, considering medieval diets, wasn't far from the truth. Of course, not everyone had the luxury of restful sleep. Servants rose before dawn. Watchmen stayed up all night. Women caring for newborns barely slept at all. And in every household, someone was always listening, for the creak of a shutter, the cry of a child, the whisper of wind through thatch. Night was communal in a way it no longer is. Even your sleep belonged to others. Beds themselves were curious things. The very rich had ornate, canopied constructions, carved wood, curtains, feather mattresses, the works. But those curtains weren't for romance or luxury. They were for warmth, and occasionally privacy from the rats. Most households shared beds, and not always with family. Travelers, apprentices, even strangers might end up side by side, divided only by a pillow and the unspoken rule not to breathe too loudly. In poorer homes, bedding was simple: straw, wool, or even piles of dry leaves. You didn't so much climb into bed as collapse into an arrangement of scratchy things and hope for the best. And every night, you prayed you wouldn't wake up covered in fleas. Spoiler, you usually did. But let's not romanticize it. Even for the wealthy, night was rarely peaceful. Servants padded quietly through corridors to check fires, empty chamber pots, or deliver warming pans. Metal trays filled with coals slid between the sheets to take the chill off. Every so often, one would spill, and the result was a nobleman's worst nightmare: a flaming bed. Nothing humbles you quite like waking up on fire in silk pajamas. In those long, candlelit hours, insomnia wasn't uncommon. There were no sleeping pills, no white noise machines, no podcasts. Instead, people relied on home remedies. Warm milk with honey, lavender on the pillow, a prayer or three. And if that didn't work, they'd simply lie still and wait for exhaustion to win. It's oddly soothing, imagining a world where time itself felt slower, where sleep wasn't measured in hours, but in breaths between chores. The night offered room for reflection, boredom, and imagination. And maybe that's why dreams held such power. They were the only real entertainment that didn't cost a candle. One scholar in the 1500s wrote that dreams were the theater of the soul. Which is poetic until you remember that his soul's theater likely included a lot of farm animals and inexplicable nudity. Still, there's something tender about the way people regarded their dreams, as messages, as mysteries, as something worth remembering. Even nightmares had meaning. They were warnings, moral lessons from the dark. Some believed nightmares came from demons, incubi, or succubi, that sat on your chest and stole your breath. It was a convenient explanation for sleep paralysis. You'd wake, unable to move, heart pounding, convinced something invisible was pressing down on you. And in a sense, something was. It was fear, exhaustion, and a world still too dark to understand itself. In cities, the rhythms of sleep were broken by noise. Horses on cobblestone. Street vendors shouting before dawn. Church bells marking every conceivable moment. Even with all the darkness, peace was rare. People learned to nap wherever they could: fields, pews, workshops. The modern obsession with a perfect 8-hour sleep would have seemed absurd to them. Sleep was functional, flexible, and sometimes optional. Interestingly, the rich and the poor experienced the night very differently. For the poor, it was a necessary rest between labors. For the rich, it was a performance. They scheduled bedtimes the way we schedule meetings. There were rituals, servants helping you undress, brushing your hair, warming your slippers. It was the social version of hibernation. Royalty, of course, turned sleep into a spectacle. Louis XIV, the Sun King himself, had both a lever and a coucher, formal ceremonies for waking up and going to bed. Courtiers gathered to watch him do both. Imagine dozens of nobles standing around your bed, bowing as you yawn. It sounds exhausting, but apparently it was an honor. Though probably not for Louis's valet, who had to make sure the royal nightshirt was spotless at all times. The irony is that kings and queens, for all their luxury, rarely slept well. Paranoia doesn't make for restful nights. Doors were locked, guards posted, and yet the fear of assassination or scandal never truly faded. Some monarchs refused to sleep alone. Others couldn't sleep without dogs nearby, or holy relics under their pillows. One Russian Tsar even kept a loaded pistol on his nightstand. Because nothing says, "sweet dreams," like sleeping next to loaded weaponry. And yet, even surrounded by candles and comfort, they faced the same darkness as everyone else. The same creaking floors. The same whispering winds. The same thoughts that keep every human being awake at 2 in the morning, wondering what they've done with their lives. The invention of artificial light slowly began to change all of this. Gas lamps, and later electric bulbs, stretched the day beyond its natural limits. People started staying up later, working longer, and sleeping less. The two-sleep pattern faded away. The night became a time for productivity instead of reflection. Doctors at the time actually worried about it. They noticed that people seemed more anxious, more restless. But instead of blaming the lights, they blamed modern nerves. Which, to be fair, still gets blamed for everything today. Our ancestors may have feared the dark, but they respected it too. It was a boundary, a daily reminder that the world doesn't run on human schedules. When night fell, life paused. And in that pause, there was peace. So maybe there's something to learn from their midnight rituals. To step away from the constant glow, to listen to the quiet, to remember that sleep isn't just rest, it's surrender. A small act of trust that the world will still be there in the morning. So, tell me in the comments, if you lived before electricity, do you think you'd enjoy the two-sleep rhythm? Would you wake at midnight to talk, pray, or just stare into the dark for a while? Let's drift onward. Because if night shaped how we slept, it also shaped how we feared. And in the next part, we'll wander through the things that went bump, and sometimes screamed, in the pre-electric dark. Hey everyone! If you're still with me, you've survived the creeping dark of the medieval city. You've dodged the gutters, ignored the murmurs, and probably stepped in something unspeakable. Congratulations! You've reached the hour when only a few people were still awake, and they were usually the ones who couldn't afford not to be. Because in the days before electricity, staying awake after sunset wasn't a sign of nightlife or insomnia. It was a job. Someone had to guard the gates, stir the embers, and make sure the candles didn't fall over and burn down half the town. The night was dangerous, and so, naturally, someone had to draw the short straw and live in it. Let's drift into their world for a bit. In most medieval towns, the night watch wasn't exactly an elite career. It was often a punishment. Thieves, debtors, or the merely unlucky might find themselves drafted to patrol the streets after dark with nothing but a lantern and a stick. It sounds brave, until you realize that lantern light could barely reach your own shoes, and the stick was mostly symbolic. You weren't there to fight crime. You were there to ring a bell if crime happened near you, and then, ideally, run. Records from London in the 1300s mention watchmen, who were required to stay awake from sunset to sunrise. They were supposed to make rounds, check for fires, and keep an eye on suspicious strangers. But according to complaints, they often did none of these things. They were known to hide in taverns, nap in doorways, or huddle together for warmth, pretending they were guarding something important. The city officials scolded them frequently, but what could you expect? Being a watchman was cold, lonely, and unpaid work. The night, meanwhile, was full of drunks and pickpockets. Most of the time, everyone pretended the system worked. It wasn't much better in Paris. There, the sergeants de nuit patrolled with torches and halberds, but they were more like night hall monitors than police. They'd shout for people to put out their candles after curfew, scold anyone caught gambling or singing too loudly, and occasionally drag a brawler to the nearest prison. But again, most of their duty was simply to be visible, a flickering symbol of order in a city that never really slept peacefully. Let's drift east for a moment, to the Ottoman Empire. In Istanbul, a similar role was played by the Bekçi, the night watchmen who walked narrow lanes, chanting prayers and warnings as they passed. Their main enemy was fire. Wooden houses packed tightly together, oil lamps flickering in every window. One careless ember could devour an entire neighborhood. The Bekçi carried long poles tipped with iron hooks, perfect for knocking down burning beams or prying open doors. They weren't glamorous, but in a city made of wood and wind, they were essential. Fire was the great terror of the night almost everywhere. Without electricity, light was fire, and fire was unpredictable. Every candle, every oil lamp, every hearth was a potential disaster. In some towns, ordinances required that fires be covered or extinguished by a certain hour, often marked by the curfew bell. The word curfew itself comes from the French couvre-feu, meaning cover fire. It was a literal reminder to put the flames to sleep before you did. Of course, people didn't always listen. The night was when secret things happened. Forbidden meetings, whispered prayers, illicit love affairs, all illuminated by one rebellious candle flame. So while the watchmen walked the streets outside, many others stayed quietly awake inside, praying that their candle wouldn't betray them. In the countryside, there was no watch at all. The fields and forests belonged to the animals at night, and humans mostly stayed put. Still, someone had to tend the fires, especially in winter. Rural families assigned a firekeeper, often the oldest or youngest member, to wake occasionally and check the hearth. Letting the fire die meant waking to a frozen house, or worse, trying to restart a blaze from damp wood. It was a humble, thankless duty, but essential for survival. You can almost imagine it. The long, low creak of wind against thatched walls. The faint glow of embers behind iron grates. A small figure wrapped in wool, poking at the coals with a stick before crawling back under a pile of blankets. Night work wasn't always heroic. Sometimes it was just quiet persistence, the unrecorded labor of keeping warmth alive. Monasteries had their own night watch traditions, though naturally, theirs involved more prayer than patrol. Monks divided the night into canonical hours, marked by bells that sounded through the darkness. Someone always had to be awake to ring them. The office of night bellkeeper rotated, because no one wanted it twice. Imagine stumbling through cold stone corridors at 2 a.m., trying not to drop the candle while half asleep and muttering psalms. Holiness, yes, but also exhaustion. Even kings needed watchmen. Medieval castles posted guards along the walls, their torches reflected in the moats below. The night shift was the least desirable assignment, lonely, dangerous, and freezing. Many fell asleep at their posts. Some were caught, punished, or worse. Falling asleep on duty in wartime could be a death sentence. Still, fatigue is a powerful enemy. History is filled with stories of sieges won not by armies, but by the simple fact that the guards got drowsy. In ancient China, night patrols were organized by city wards. Drums or gongs marked each watch, dividing the night into 5 sections. If you heard 5 drum beats, you knew dawn was coming. These patrols also announced curfew hours, extinguished street fires, and occasionally helped travelers lost in the maze of alleys. But mostly, they existed to reassure citizens that someone, anyone, was awake while the rest slept. There's something oddly touching about that idea. The human instinct to post a guard, to assign a watcher, not because it always worked, but because we needed to believe someone was looking out for us in the dark. Before street lamps and motion sensors, that belief was the only night light most people had. But the watchers themselves didn't always fare so well. In some records, watchmen were the first to be blamed when anything went wrong: a fire, a theft, a murder. They were fined, whipped, or dismissed. The irony was that their power was almost non-existent. They couldn't chase criminals effectively in the dark. They could barely see their own hands. Their job was part ritual, part superstition, a way of pretending that chaos could be kept at bay simply by walking in circles with a torch. In smaller towns, the role of night watch sometimes rotated among citizens. Every household had to provide a man for a few nights per year. It was called the hue and cry system, a communal obligation to maintain order. Imagine being a blacksmith or baker, already exhausted from a day's work, and then being told it's your turn to guard the square until dawn. Most men brought ale to keep themselves awake, which helped them forget how miserable they were. The result was predictably mixed. Some sang songs, others dozed. Crime probably didn't go down, but at least the ale was warm. Let's drift to the 18th century now, when London began to modernize its night patrols. The Watchmen were still famously incompetent. Satirists like William Hogarth mocked them in prints, snoring through robberies or stumbling drunk through fog. They wore greatcoats and carried rattles, a sort of wooden alarm that made a loud clacking noise when spun. In theory, it was to call for help. In practice, it was often used to scare rats. Charles Dickens, writing a century later, remembered these figures fondly but pitifully, shuffling through gaslit streets, half asleep, half frozen, muttering to themselves. They were relics of an age before true policing, when the line between security and symbolic comfort was as thin as candle smoke. Elsewhere, watchmen took on stranger forms. In some parts of rural Scotland, there were grave watchers, hired to guard new burials from body snatchers, those entrepreneurial souls who supplied medical schools with fresh cadavers. These watchers sat in huts beside cemeteries, lanterns burning through the night, ready to chase away would-be thieves. It was quiet work, but unsettling. You had company, but it was buried. In the Nordic countries, night watchmen often doubled as musicians. They carried horns or flutes and played soft tunes at certain hours to mark the passing of time. There's something soothing about that, the sound of a distant melody drifting through snowy streets at midnight, reminding everyone that morning still exists. A few towns even kept this tradition into the 19th century, long after it stopped being necessary. Some people just couldn't sleep without it. Firefighters, too, lived by night. In Japan's Edo period, city fires were so frequent that special brigades, the Haikshire, were formed to respond quickly. They wore distinctive coats and carried ladders, drums, and banners. When alarm bells rang, they rushed through dark alleys, shouting warnings. Most of their work took place after sunset, when lamps and cooking fires were still active. The sight of flickering torches rushing through wooden streets must have been terrifying and strangely beautiful, a dance of light meant to fight light itself. Even in palaces, someone had to keep watch. Royal households employed night porters and chamberlains of the bedchamber, whose job was to stay nearby in case a candle guttered, a draught entered, or the monarch woke with indigestion. These attendants often slept on stools or folded blankets, one eye open, trained to respond at the faintest sound. The irony, of course, is that kings who ruled empires were still afraid of the dark. You might say that's a universal truth. No matter how grand the civilization, everyone feared the night a little. Whether you were a peasant guarding a fire, a monk ringing a bell, or a watchman patrolling empty streets, you were part of humanity's long, uneasy truce with darkness. And it's a truce that lasted until the 19th century, when electricity began to spread and the ancient order of the night started to crumble. Street lamps glowed where once torches flickered. Watchmen became policemen. Firekeepers became factory workers. The world learned to stay awake without fear, though perhaps not without consequences. But let's not rush there just yet. The darkness still has stories to tell. So before we move on, think of those unseen figures, the watchers, the keepers, the sleepers who stirred from their beds to feed the fire or check the locks. They didn't leave monuments or portraits, but they made every sunrise possible. If you'd lived back then, would you have volunteered for the night watch? Or would you have pretended to snore and let someone else face the dark? Tell me in the comments. After all, you're safely in the light now. Let's drift onward, into the next quiet corner of the night, where dreams met superstition, and the world between sleep and waking was thinner than you might think. Hey everyone! If you've made it this far, you've walked past the watchman, dodged the thieves, and managed not to set the house on fire. Congratulations! Now comes the most universal danger of all, one that no lantern could prevent and no curfew bell could control. The simple act of falling asleep. It seems so ordinary to us now. We treat sleep as routine, as predictable as breathing. You close your eyes, and eventually morning happens. But for most of human history, that was far from guaranteed. Sleep was never considered safe. It was a small death, an experiment in trust, conducted every single night. You had to believe the world would still be there when you woke up. And people, being people, didn't entirely believe that. Before electricity, sleep happened in near-total darkness. No humming streetlights, no glows from digital clocks, no faint blue rectangle of a phone screen. Just the black. The kind of darkness that doesn't end at the walls, it fills them, presses in, erases. You'd hear things more than see them, the scratching of rats, the wind's uneven breath, the slow expansion of wood in the cold. Even the ticking of time itself was measured by the sound of your own heart. It's easy to understand why the night bred superstition. For centuries, people thought that sleep made the soul wander. While the body rested, the spirit was free to drift, through dreams, through distant places, even through dangerous realms. You could meet the dead there. You could meet things that weren't dead but perhaps wished you were. The ancient Greeks believed dreams were messages, sometimes from the gods, sometimes from restless shades. Aristotle thought they were fragments of the day's thoughts, bubbling up through the body's warmth. Others thought they were literal visitations, proof that the soul had slipped out for a midnight stroll. If you woke suddenly, you risked catching it halfway home. This idea wasn't uniquely Greek. In many medieval European beliefs, the sleeping body was a fragile container. It could be sat upon, suffocated, or possessed by invisible forces. If you woke unable to move, it wasn't sleep paralysis. It was the mare, an evil spirit sitting on your chest, feeding on your breath. That's where the word nightmare comes from, not the bad dream, but the creature itself. Imagine waking in a pitch-black room, heart hammering, unable to shout, unable to move. You'd feel the weight pressing down, sense a presence, maybe see a shadow near the bed. Today we'd call it a physiological glitch, a brief overlap between REM sleep and waking consciousness. Back then, you'd probably call for a priest. Or you'd pray you could still breathe long enough to outlast it. Every culture had its own version of this night terror. In Scandinavian folklore, it was the Mara, a ghostly woman who crept into homes and knelt upon sleepers' chests. In Japan, it was the kanashibari, meaning bound in metal, an invisible paralysis inflicted by spirits or angry ghosts. In parts of the Caribbean, there was the kakma, a small, restless soul of a dead child who would sit astride a victim's chest until they couldn't breathe. The details varied, but the feeling was the same, helplessness in the dark. And all of this was taken seriously. People devised rituals, charms, and protective symbols to defend themselves from nocturnal assaults. Iron under the pillow. Garlic near the window. Crosses drawn in ash. Even the placement of the bed mattered. In some traditions, sleeping with your head toward the west was an invitation to death, the direction of the setting sun. So the headboards were carefully turned east, toward the dawn. Toward hope. It sounds quaint now, but remember, when your nights are this dark, logic fades with the light. You don't need to be ignorant to fear the dark. You just need to have lived in it. Dreams, too, were treated with reverence and suspicion. They were decoded like letters from the unseen world. There were entire manuals for interpreting them, dream books that listed common symbols and their meanings. If you dreamed of water, it might mean fortune or danger, depending on whether it was calm or stormy. If you dreamed of teeth falling out, it foretold death. Which, frankly, must have made ancient dentists very nervous people. One of the oldest dream manuals we have is the Onira Critica by Artemidorus, written in the 2nd century CE. It's essentially a guide to decoding your subconscious, though he wouldn't have called it that. It's full of delightfully weird associations. Dreaming of losing your hair was a bad omen if you were rich, but a good one if you were poor, because poverty made baldness less noticeable. Dreaming of flying was dangerous, unless you happened to be a slave, in which case it meant freedom. A very practical psychology, really. Depending on who you were, the same dream could be liberation or disaster. The Middle Ages added another layer of anxiety. Sleep wasn't just when dreams came, it was when temptation did. Monks wrote about nocturnal assaults, meaning both demonic attacks and more earthly impulses. The human body, inconveniently, doesn't share theology's sense of timing. So the night became a battlefield of sorts, the mind trying to pray, the body trying to do something else entirely. One can imagine that sleep, for some monks, felt less like rest and more like a nightly negotiation. People also feared dying in their sleep, not just because it happened, but because it was believed to mean something. Dying peacefully, without struggle, was considered both a blessing and a warning. Perhaps the angels had come. Or perhaps something else had. Many prayers ended with variations of, "Deliver us, O Lord, from sudden death," which sounds noble until you realize it also meant, "Please let me have time to repent before I die." It's strange, isn't it, how deeply we once distrusted our own need for rest. To sleep was to surrender control, to go offline in a world that didn't pause with you. No watchman guarded the inside of your skull. Anything could happen in there. Some historians think that fear of sleep contributed to the two sleeps pattern common in pre-industrial Europe. People didn't usually sleep 8 hours straight. They had first sleep and second sleep, separated by a waking period in the middle of the night. During that time, people would pray, smoke, check the fire, even visit neighbors. It wasn't insomnia, it was a socially accepted intermission in the nightly truce with darkness. This midnight interval was called the watch. It was considered a thoughtful, even spiritual time. There are letters from the 16th and 17th centuries describing people reflecting on their dreams, writing down ideas, or chatting quietly by the hearth. Some couples used the time for intimacy, which certainly beats scrolling on your phone. Others just sat and listened to the quiet, a kind of pre-modern mindfulness. But even then, superstition hovered. Waking in the dead middle of the night meant you were between worlds, when the veil was thin, when spirits wandered. Church bells might mark the witching hour, and many preferred not to look out the window during that time, just in case something looked back. Let's drift for a moment to a small cottage in 1600s England. The fire has sunk low. A woman wakes from first sleep, heart racing. She's had a dream of someone knocking at the door. It felt real enough that she checks. Nothing. Only the wind and the snow. Still, she crosses herself before returning to bed. Because everyone knew, dreams could be warnings. And it never hurt to be polite to the unseen. In towns, night dreams sometimes spilled into day business. Courts actually recorded cases where dreams were cited as evidence. Someone would swear they dreamed of a murder or theft, and sometimes that dream led to a real investigation. A few were even solved that way, which must have made skeptics slightly uncomfortable. You could almost imagine someone confessing just to make the dream stop. The medical world had its own theories, of course. Physicians in the Middle Ages thought nightmares were caused by indigestion, that undigested food rose as vapors to the brain, producing disturbing visions. So, to prevent bad dreams, you were advised to avoid cheese before bed. Modern science hasn't entirely disproved that one, though it's been rebranded as "don't eat heavy meals late." Humanity, it seems, never quite escapes its bedtime wisdom. As centuries passed, sleep gradually lost its supernatural charge. By the 18th century, philosophers like Locke and Hume were describing dreams in more psychological terms, reflections of thought and memory rather than divine messages. But ordinary people, especially in rural areas, kept their old beliefs. They still saw dreams as omens, and they still slept with protective charms. A piece of iron under the pillow, a Bible on the nightstand, a candle left burning low. Tradition fades slowly when it's tied to fear. And then came new fears. The Industrial Revolution changed sleep itself. Gaslight and later electricity extended the day, compressing the night into smaller fragments. People began sleeping less, and worrying more about it. Doctors in the 19th century started writing about insomnia as a disease, not a symptom. Imagine that, after thousands of years of fearing sleep, people had finally found a way to fear not sleeping. But that's getting ahead of ourselves. For now, picture those candlelit bedrooms, those creaking beds, those hearts pounding in the dark. Every shadow could be something. Every dream could mean anything. It wasn't a rational world, but it was an alive one. And maybe that's something we've lost. Our nights are safer now, brighter, emptier. Few of us see true darkness anymore. We don't meet the strange visitors who once came in dreams, or wonder whether the knock at midnight was real. The monsters are gone, or perhaps just hiding behind screens. Still, next time you wake at 3 a.m., staring at the ceiling and hearing something shift in the house, maybe don't be too quick to call it the plumbing. After all, if our ancestors were wrong about everything, how did their stories last this long? What about you? Do you dream vividly, or hardly at all? Tell me in the comments. I'm curious how many of us still carry a little of that old fear of the night. Let's drift onward next time, into the other side of this darkness, not the inner world of sleep, but the outer one, how entire cities learned to light the night, and how that changed everything. Hey everyone, welcome back. Let's keep the candles burning low as we drift a little deeper into the strange and uneasy world that existed between dusk and dawn. Tonight, We're settling into the creaking wooden frame of an ordinary house before electricity. You can imagine it, the kind of structure that was never quite quiet, where shadows moved almost of their own accord, and the walls seemed to breathe with the air of the sleeping. It's strange how much a house changes once the sun goes down. The same beams that looked so sturdy at noon seemed to groan with mystery by midnight. Houses in pre-electric times were fragile little worlds. Every floorboard had a voice, every gust of wind a personality. You didn't need to believe in ghosts to feel uneasy. A door could swing open because of pressure changes, but no one understood air currents in those centuries. Naturally, that meant the door was probably opened by something supernatural, perhaps the spirit of a distant aunt, or a neighbor who died in questionable circumstances. It's remarkable how the limits of lighting created limits of logic too. At night, homes were wrapped in layers of practical defense. Shutters closed tight, doors barred with wooden beams, and sometimes people even sealed cracks in a wall with rags or clay to block drafts, or whatever else they thought might creep in. Fire was the greatest danger. People went to bed with a sense of dread about their own hearth. A single spark could undo everything, so the last ritual before sleep was always about the fire. Bank it, smother it, whisper to it. There were entire traditions around this. In some rural English homes, the ashes were spread over the embers in a cross pattern to bless the fire and keep it safely sleeping. Inside, darkness was its own presence. It wasn't simply an absence of light, it was almost tangible. Imagine standing in a medieval cottage with no glass windows, just shutters. The only light comes from a dying ember in the hearth. Beyond that small circle of glow, the walls vanish into blackness. Even the people you live with are reduced to breathing and the occasional rustle of movement. It's no wonder so many ghost stories came from homes. And those homes were noisy. Wooden beams expanded and contracted, thatch rustled, and small creatures, mice, rats, beetles, made their presence known. People didn't separate themselves from the natural world the way we do now. They lived alongside it. It shared their shelter. In many homes, animals even slept indoors, chickens, goats, and sometimes a cow in the winter for warmth. The result was that night in the pre-electric world wasn't peaceful. It was alive with sound. Not the mechanical hum of refrigerators or distant cars, but something much more primal. A scratching, sighing, living kind of sound. What's interesting is how the human imagination filled those noises with personality. A tapping at the roof might be an ancestor knocking. A whisper of wind at the door might be the devil asking to come in. There were whole local traditions to interpret these sounds. In parts of Scotland, a house that creaked too much was said to be haunted by the dead wind, a spirit that foretold death in the family. In Italy, a squeak near the floorboards might be a sign of good fortune instead. It depended on where you lived, but one thing was constant: no noise was meaningless. Even the way people slept inside their homes was shaped by the dark. Bedrooms weren't like ours. For most families, everyone slept in one room, or even in one bed. In small cottages, it was common for parents, children, and sometimes a visiting relative to share the same sleeping area, often covered by a single heavy blanket or animal skin. Privacy was not a concept that translated well before the electric age. The night was communal, and the home was a shared cocoon. In wealthier homes, the story wasn't much different, though there were more layers between you and the darkness. Candles flickered in silver holders, curtains hung heavy over windows, and the air smelled faintly of wax and wool. Still, even a noble home could feel like a trap after dark. Without electric lighting, even a grand castle was lit by a handful of small flames. Shadows were enormous. Corridors disappeared into black. Servants moved quietly through them with lanterns, their faces lit in warm halos of light that vanished as they turned corners. Servants had their own relationship with the night. They were the ones expected to stay up later, tending fires, cleaning after meals, preparing for the morning. Candle wax was expensive, so most work was done by memory and touch. A maid might know her master's study so well she could clean it in pitch darkness. A cook might lay out dough or stir a pot by feel, guided by scent and texture. If you think about it, their senses were sharper in ways most of us can't imagine. We live in constant brightness, they lived in gradients of shadow. And then there were the fears. Not of robbers or beasts, but of unseen forces. In some homes, people left a bowl of milk out at night for spirits or household fairies, a kind of spiritual insurance. In Slavic traditions, it was for the domovoi, a house spirit who protected or punished depending on how you treated him. If you heard something fall in the night, you might whisper a quick apology to the domovoi before going back to sleep. Imagine living with the idea that your own house might get offended if you didn't show it enough respect. Let's drift for a moment into how rooms themselves were designed for the night. Beds were high, partly to stay warmer, but also to stay above whatever moved on the floor. The space beneath the bed, that childhood source of nightmares, had a very real purpose: storage and perhaps distance from pests. Bed curtains were drawn not just for privacy, but for warmth and safety. Inside those heavy drapes, the world narrowed to the sound of breathing and the faint glow of the coals. In towns, things were no better. Streets might be silent, but houses whispered to each other. Candles flickered behind shutters, sometimes blowing out and plunging an entire home into black. There were no switches to flip, no instant remedy. If your light went out, you'd need to stumble through darkness to find flint and steel, hoping you didn't trip over furniture or frighten your family. Night demanded patience and care. Every act, lighting a candle, stirring the fire, was deliberate. People developed nighttime routines to cope. Some said a prayer before bed not for protection from sin, but for protection from the dark itself. Others relied on superstition. In parts of France, people believed that if you slept with your shoes pointing toward the door, death would enter your home. So, shoes faced the wall. In Ireland, they turned mirrors toward the wall before sleeping, fearing they could trap spirits of the living. A house at night was a web of quiet rituals meant to tame invisible fears. What's striking is how the very concept of home changed with electricity. Before, it wasn't a place of permanent safety. It was temporary shelter, fragile against fire, theft, and superstition. Families huddled closer together, physically and emotionally, because the darkness outside and the half-darkness inside both reminded them how small they were. And of course, night made people introspective. Many diaries from the 17th and 18th centuries include nighttime reflections, thoughts recorded by candlelight when the rest of the house was asleep. The flicker of a flame could turn even a practical mind poetic. The writer Samuel Pepys described lying awake, watching shadows play on his ceiling, feeling half terrified and half fascinated by the stillness. He wasn't alone in that. The stillness was often more frightening than noise. Even the wealthy, surrounded by servants, couldn't escape it. In one of Queen Victoria's letters, she complained about the distressing loneliness of the night, how the gaslight cast odd shapes on the walls of her room. For all her power, she was as helpless as anyone once the lamps were out. Night didn't care for status. It's easy to think of old homes as cozy, candlelit places filled with charm. And sometimes they were. But more often, they were places of constant awareness, a kind of quiet vigilance. You didn't forget the fragility of your world when a single ember could destroy it. You didn't take safety for granted when you could hear the wind sigh through gaps in your roof. So the next time you turn off a light, maybe think about what it meant to live without that luxury. To know that every sound had to be interpreted, every movement explained, and every shadow respected. People lived with the dark as if it were a housemate, unpredictable, sometimes menacing, occasionally kind. And if your house creaks tonight, don't worry. It's probably just the wood settling. Or perhaps, as they used to say, it's a reminder that every home, no matter how modern, still remembers the centuries it spent afraid of the night. What do you think you'd have done back then? Would you have slept peacefully in that darkness, or kept one candle burning, just in case? Let me know down in the comments before we drift onward to the next part, where we'll step outside again, into the wild world of nocturnal work, travel, and danger beyond the walls. Hey everyone, welcome back. Let's stay half awake together for a little longer. The fire's burning low, and somewhere out there, in the distant past, someone is just beginning their shift. You see, while most people before electricity treated the night like something to endure, others made a living inside it. They didn't wait for dawn. They worked through the dark, cautiously, resentfully, or sometimes even proudly. Let's drift to a time when working at night was an act of quiet rebellion against nature. Because for centuries, human sleep patterns were dictated not by choice, but by necessity. When light vanished, most labor stopped. But of course, there were exceptions. People whose lives were tethered to the shadows. Bakers, watchmen, midwives, sailors, thieves. the forgotten half of society who lived when others slept. Imagine the baker, rising before dawn, long before the first streaks of gray appeared. The world was silent except for his footsteps and the faint grinding of grain. He'd light his oven in the dark, hoping the flames caught quickly and didn't waste precious wood. Flour dust drifted in the candlelight like fog. He'd work in half-light for hours, kneading dough by feel more than sight. When townspeople woke up, he'd already been laboring for hours. His entire world happened before sunrise. The night was also the domain of the Watchmen, those slightly underappreciated figures who wandered streets with lanterns and long sticks, announcing the hours to no one in particular. "Past 1 o'clock, and all's well." It's such a comforting phrase, though few people probably found it comforting at the time. The call of the watchman was both assurance and reminder that something out there needed watching. Before organized police, the night watch was the only thing standing between a sleeping city and whatever might creep in from the darkness. In medieval London, watchmen patrolled with lanterns and rattles, more to scare thieves than to catch them. Most were older men or poor laborers earning extra pay. They worked through fog and filth, muttering to themselves to stay awake. Some were brave. Many were drunk. The line between public service and public nuisance was often blurry. Still, the idea of night shift was broader than we imagine. In rural villages, shepherds guarded their flocks under the stars. Their eyes adjusted to the faintest glimmer of movement. A shepherd could tell the difference between a wolf and a shadow, between the wind and danger. It was a lonely job, done mostly in silence, with only the distant howls and the slow drift of clouds for company. Then there were midwives, perhaps the bravest of all nighttime workers. Birth rarely obeyed convenient timing, and so they were summoned at any hour, carrying their tools and their faith through the blackness between houses. They were used to moving in darkness, familiar with the sounds of sleeping families, the bark of a dog startled by their passing. Candles were precious, but a birth at night was always attended by at least one flame, held close. It wasn't just light, it was symbolic. A living fire welcoming a new life. The blacksmith, the cobbler, the mason, they all slept. But the innkeeper, the coachman, the sailors, their world was the nights. Ships, after all, didn't stop when the sun went down. On the decks of 18th-century vessels, sailors worked under starlight or the thin glow of a lantern, adjusting ropes and keeping watch for reefs or enemy ships. Sea life made men half-nocturnal by necessity. And though the sea at night was breathtaking, black water reflecting black sky, it was also deeply terrifying. Without moonlight, you couldn't see where the horizon ended. The ocean seemed infinite. A candle on deck might as well have been a single heartbeat in a void. Even on land, travel at night was sometimes unavoidable. Stagecoach drivers pushed on through darkness to make deadlines. Imagine the sound, the horses' hooves dull on the dirt road, the driver squinting into nothing, the lantern swinging uselessly in the wind. Inside the coach, passengers whispered prayers or dozed, each bump reminding them how far they were from safety. Thieves waited in ambush on forest roads, knowing that fear did half their work for them. The very concept of a highwayman depends on the darkness. No moon, no courage required. Cities, though, cities were their own beasts after dusk. By the 18th century, some began experimenting with night industries. Factories in London and Paris used oil lamps or early gaslight to extend working hours. It was revolutionary, but also miserable. Workers stumbled home half-blind from smoke and fatigue. Time lost meaning when the night became another part of the workday. A candle could double your profit, but it could also double your misery. Before electricity, illumination wasn't just light. It was time. Whoever controlled the flame controlled when life began and ended each day. Poorer families had short nights, not because they slept less, but because they couldn't afford light to stay awake. A candle might cost an hour's wage. You learned to economize your sight, to save your eyes for daylight. Wealthy people could stay up longer, reading, writing, or drinking under chandeliers, while peasants surrendered to the dark. But some kinds of night work didn't fit easily into morality. Take grave robbing, for example, technically a profession of its own in 18th and 19th century Europe. Medical schools paid well for fresh corpses, and thieves called resurrection men worked exclusively by night. They'd sneak into cemeteries with shovels, guided by moonlight or shaded lanterns, and dig with silent precision. There were real rules to it: never light the lantern too early, always cover your tracks, and never speak above a whisper. You can almost imagine the sound: shovels scraping softly, soil falling, the distant hoot of an owl. It's grim, but strangely poetic, how necessity could turn the night into a marketplace for the forbidden. Another kind of night worker was the link boy, those children who, for a small coin, guided pedestrians through city streets with a torch. The link boy's job was simple but dangerous. They were visible targets for thieves and had to navigate through drunk crowds, carriages, and open sewers. Many were orphans or street children, often under 10 years old. It's heartbreaking, really, to imagine a child holding a flame taller than himself, lighting the way for gentlemen too afraid to walk home alone. In rural Europe, the equivalent might be the moonlighter. Not the modern romantic version, the literal one. Farmers would use bright moonlit nights to finish harvesting or hay cutting, taking advantage of any light nature offered. It wasn't uncommon to see entire fields alive with silhouettes moving under the moon. They called it moon work. It was peaceful in a way, but also eerie. The sound of scythes, the whisper of grass, and the pale light made it feel like working inside a dream. Not all night work was labor. Some was devotion. Monks, especially in medieval monasteries, lived by strict schedules that divided the night into hours of prayer. They rose in the middle of the night to chant in candlelit chapels, voices echoing off stone walls. The idea was to keep the rhythm of time unbroken, to remind the world that even in darkness, there was continuity. The sound of those hymns drifting into the cold air must have been haunting, almost timeless. It's easy to forget how dangerous it all was. Without streetlights, a worker moving between tasks could fall, vanish, or be attacked without anyone knowing. Even something as simple as carrying a lantern posed risks. It could explode, or catch your clothing. Fire, always fire, hovered as the background threat. Yet the people who worked in the night developed a kind of resilience that's hard to grasp today. Their bodies adjusted. They learned to see by the faintest glimmers. They became creatures of instinct. Some wrote that the world looked entirely different at night, more honest, more reflective. Maybe because when you can't see much, you start noticing more. The sound of wind through a broken shutter, the shift of your own heartbeat, it all becomes sharper. In many towns, there were night markets. Especially in southern Europe and Asia, heat made daytime labor exhausting, so vendors came out after sunset. You'd find flickering stalls of oil lamps, sizzling food, laughter and murmurs, and the faint smell of smoke. Night didn't always mean danger. Sometimes it meant life rearranged itself around the dark. People adapted, as they always do. And then there were the intellectuals, the night thinkers. Writers, philosophers, scientists who found that darkness brought clarity. The absence of light meant fewer distractions. The mathematician Carl Friedrich Gauss preferred working late, using only a single candle. Voltaire wrote letters through the small hours. Even in ancient China, poets spoke of the ink hour, that quiet window before dawn when thought came easily. So perhaps the night wasn't just dangerous. It was generous too, at least for those brave enough to meet it. So while most people huddled in fear, there was always a small, stubborn group who thrived under moonlight. They saw opportunity where others saw threat. Whether baking bread, catching thieves, robbing graves, or writing poems, they all shared one thing: an understanding that the dark didn't belong only to nightmares. It belonged to those willing to see differently. Now, as we drift out of this dim workshop of humanity, you might wonder, if you had lived back then, would you have chosen the night? Would you have stayed by the hearth, or stepped into the blackness with your own lantern? Let me know in the comments what kind of night worker you think you'd have been: a baker, a poet, or maybe the watchman whispering, "All's well." Hey everyone, welcome back. Let's settle in again, maybe pull the blanket a little higher. Tonight, we're stepping outside the faint circle of candlelight, into the real night. The kind that stretched beyond the walls and fields, where civilization thinned and imagination took over. It's easy to forget that for most of human history, the dark wasn't peaceful. It was something to be survived. Before electricity, nighttime was dangerous by design. You weren't meant to see well, you weren't meant to wander. Nature itself turned against you, the temperature dropped, the air grew heavy with mist, and predators stirred. The boundary between human space and wild space blurred. A city gate that seemed solid in daylight felt like a fragile promise by midnight. And if you had to travel, you did so with prayers, weapons, and a very fast horse. We like to romanticize the moonlight now, that soft silver glow, the quiet of empty streets. But to our ancestors, the moon was both a friend and a trickster. Too much darkness, and you couldn't see your way. Too much moonlight, and thieves could see you. It was a lose-lose situation illuminated by fear. Let's start with the most primal danger: animals. Europe before the modern age wasn't neatly domesticated. Wolves roamed forests near villages, and bears occasionally wandered close to settlements. In rural France, shepherds kept fires burning all night to keep predators at bay. In Germany, children were warned not to leave home after dusk, not because of strangers, but because of the black wolf of the woods. People didn't see animals as separate from myth. A wolf was never just a wolf. It was an omen, a punishment, a test of faith. Even domesticated animals were part of the threat. Horses startled easily, oxen broke free, and dogs turned wild at night. Before fencing and electric lamps, entire farms could be undone by a spooked herd. Farmers slept lightly, half expecting to be woken by the sound of panic from the stables. Then there were human predators: thieves, highwaymen, deserters, and desperate peasants looking for food. Darkness leveled the playing field. You didn't need strength or wealth to have the upper hand, only nerve and a good hiding place. A road that looked inviting in daylight became a trap after sunset. Travelers carried clubs, daggers, or even stones in their pockets, just in case. The fear of night robbery was so intense that entire laws were written to control it. In 13th century England, the curfew bell rang at sunset to remind citizens to extinguish fires and stay indoors. The word curfew comes from the French couvre-feu, cover the fire. But it was more than a fire precaution. It was a way to keep people from wandering where the law couldn't follow. Once that bell rang, anyone caught outside after dark risked being mistaken for a criminal. Cities tried to control the danger by enforcing night patrols, but with limited success. In Paris, medieval records describe entire neighborhoods where even guards refused to go after midnight. London had similar problems. The streets were narrow, unlit, and full of opportunity for mischief. Early reports from the 1700s mention watchmen being bribed by thieves to look the other way. Nighttime, one satirical pamphlet wrote, is when honesty sleeps and everyone else wakes. Travel between towns was worse. Roads were rarely maintained, bridges could collapse, and forests hid all manner of problems, both real and imagined. Highwaymen were a particular terror. They weren't just thieves, they were icons of the dark. Their silhouettes appeared in countless stories, always emerging from behind a tree or out of a ditch, pistols drawn, saying something polite like, "Your money or your life." Some of them really did become legends, like Dick Turpin, whose supposed gallantry later became the stuff of fiction. In truth, most were just desperate men with bad aim and worse luck. Beyond criminals and creatures, there was another kind of danger, the supernatural. To live before electricity was to live inside a shared dreamscape. Every shadow could be a ghost, every whisper an omen. Churches warned people against night wandering, not only because of crime, but because it was thought that evil spirits roamed freely once the sun went down. In some parts of Europe, it was believed that witches flew only at night because darkness was their ally. If you saw a strange light in the woods, you didn't assume it was a lantern. You assumed it was the devil. Superstition acted like a safety system. People invented stories to explain and contain their fear. The will-o'-the-wisp, those eerie flickers of swamp gas, became tales of ghostly lights that lured travelers off the road. In Japan, yurei, wandering spirits, appeared in legends as pale figures drifting through the mist, often near water. The human imagination did most of the night's work. And of course, there was disease. Darkness hid rot. It concealed pests, unclean water, and infected wounds. Before germ theory, people thought illness came from night air, the belief that darkness itself carried sickness. Windows were kept tightly shut, and people slept with herbs near their beds to ward off the invisible miasma. It's fascinating, really, they weren't wrong that night carried danger, they just misunderstood why. There were subtler fears too, social ones. Night was when reputations could be ruined. A knock at the door after dark meant trouble, or gossip, or scandal. Secret meetings, forbidden romances, conspiracies, all these happened under the cover of night. The same darkness that terrified people also offered them privacy. It's ironic how the most moral societies always saved their most immoral behavior for when no one could see it. For women, the night was especially perilous. Traveling alone after dusk was considered reckless, even scandalous. In towns, there were unofficial curfews for women, and those caught outside risked being labeled immoral, regardless of reason. The world wasn't just dangerous, it was judgmental. Night amplified both. In some cities, people hired escorts to walk them home. Not the glamorous kind, literal escorts with lanterns or cudgels, ready to fend off attackers. It was an early version of personal security, centuries before flashlights or streetlights made it unnecessary. Even well-born men avoided dark alleys. It wasn't cowardice, it was common sense. But not all dangers came from others. Some were built into the environment. Open wells, unmarked ditches, and rivers without bridges claimed lives constantly. Without visibility, even the most familiar landscape turned treacherous. There are stories of people drowning just steps from home, their lanterns found floating nearby. Sometimes the night was simply indifferent. Night also played tricks on the mind. Fatigue, hunger, and low light made hallucinations common. People reported seeing lights that weren't there, hearing whispers in the trees, feeling watched. And without any real way to disprove what they saw, these stories spread. Fear, it turns out, was contagious. What's fascinating is that societies learned to ritualize these fears. Nighttime prayers, protective charms, and bedtime routines weren't just superstition, they were psychological armor. When you told yourself the Lord's Prayer or burned sage, you weren't just warding off spirits, you were reminding yourself that the darkness could be survived. And survive it they did. Humans are adaptable creatures. We made rules for the dark, like we do for everything else. Certain tasks were never done after sunset, spinning wool, cutting hair, digging graves, because it invited misfortune. Others were encouraged, like mending clothes or telling stories. Entire family traditions developed around staying safely occupied between sundown and sleep. In a way, the fireside story was a kind of collective defense, using imagination to master the unknown. Think about it, storytelling as survival. The family gathers close, shadows flicker on the wall, and someone begins with, "There once was a traveler who didn't listen to his mother." It's not just entertainment. It's a moral lesson wrapped in myth. Don't go out after dark, don't trust strangers, respect the night. The entire oral tradition of folklore probably owes its existence to the absence of light. As the centuries crept on, things began to change. Oil lamps improved, glassmaking advanced, and eventually, cities experimented with gaslight. The first streetlights appeared in the 17th and 18th centuries, flickering like tiny stars against the black. They didn't banish fear overnight, but they began to redefine it. Light no longer came only from fire or the moon. Humanity was learning to fight back against the dark. But before that glow spread everywhere, the night remained something ancient, something alive. It was more than a time of day. It was a world within the world, filled with creatures, criminals, and whispers. The danger was real, but so was the awe. You could be terrified and enchanted at the same time. So, if you were standing in that world, centuries ago, lantern in hand, road stretching ahead into the unknown, would you have walked on? Or waited until dawn, like most did, huddled by the fire, pretending to sleep while listening to every creak? Tell me in the comments, what would you have done? Because next time, we'll drift into something quieter. How people actually slept through all of this. What the night was like inside the body, not outside. Welcome back, traveler of time. Tonight, as the world quiets and the light fades, we turn from the dangers outside to the strange, intimate world inside. The story of how people slept, and what sleep even meant, before the modern bed, before silence, before safety. So go ahead, settle in. Because in the old world, night didn't just mean danger, it meant endurance. For most of human history, sleep wasn't something soft or simple. It wasn't about comfort, it was about survival. The modern bed, with its mattress, pillows, and blankets, would have looked almost royal to our ancestors. Let's start in the Middle Ages. If you were poor, which most people were, your bed was likely a sack stuffed with straw, hay, reeds, or even leaves. Sometimes it was just a pile of straw on the floor, maybe covered with rough linen if you were lucky. People called it a palliasse. It didn't smell good. It didn't last long. And it attracted fleas. The word bed itself didn't always mean furniture. It meant a place for sleeping. You might sleep in a bed of straw, or bed of rushes. The rich, of course, had the luxury of wooden bed frames, feather mattresses, and heavy curtains to block drafts. But even in castles, comfort came second to warmth. Rooms weren't heated like ours. Fireplaces gave off uneven heat, so people layered up. Woolen blankets, furs, even cloaks were piled high. In winter, people sometimes wore caps or gloves to bed. The goal wasn't coziness. It was survival. Sleeping together was normal. Privacy didn't really exist the way it does now. In most peasant homes, the entire family shared one bed or one room. Parents, children, sometimes servants, all under the same blanket, pressed close for warmth. In inns or goose houses, strangers shared beds too. You could pay half the price for a half bed, meaning you'd share it with whoever came next. Travelers wrote about waking up beside complete strangers, or even thieves, in crowded roadside taverns. There was no embarrassment, just necessity. Beds were scarce, and night was cold. In fact, the word bedfellow literally meant what it sounds like, someone you shared your sleeping space with. Even kings had them. Court records show that young nobles or attendants often slept beside their rulers, not out of intimacy, but tradition and protection. The bedchamber was a place of trust. Now let's talk about the strangest part, the rhythm of sleep. Before artificial light, people didn't sleep in one solid block like we do now. They had two sleeps. The first was called the first sleep, or dead sleep. People went to bed shortly after dark, around 9 or 10 p.m., and slept for about 4 hours. Then they woke up, fully awake, for an hour or two in the middle of the night. This period was known as the watch or watching hour. During that time, people prayed, wrote, tended fires, made love, even visited neighbors. Diaries and letters from the 15th to 18th centuries mention this midnight waking as a normal part of life. Afterwards, they went back to sleep for a second sleep until dawn. Why? Because human bodies naturally follow that rhythm in darkness. Without electric light, melatonin levels rise earlier in the evening and dip around midnight. So people woke up, did quiet things, then slept again. It wasn't insomnia. It was biology. Imagine it, the whole world dark, the fire low, the village silent except for distant dogs and the sound of your own breath. You wake. You sit. Maybe you whisper a prayer, check on the children, stir the coals. It's peaceful in a strange, private way, a time that belonged only to you. In wealthier homes, beds were elaborate works of craftsmanship. Frames carved from oak or walnut. Canopies draped with velvet. Curtains not for beauty, but for insulation, to trap body heat and block drafts. Beds were status symbols. They were so valuable that they were often listed in wills. In some noble households, servants were even tasked with warming the bed by placing hot stones or metal pans filled with embers beneath the sheets before their masters retired. These early bed warmers were dangerous. A careless servant could scorch the bedding, or worse, set it on fire. But comfort was worth the risk. Even pillows weren't universal. In many medieval cultures, people slept propped slightly upright, believing it was unhealthy to lie flat. Pillows were rare among peasants. In Asia, wooden or ceramic headrests were used instead, keeping hairstyles intact and necks supported. The night itself shaped how people slept. Cities were noisy, even in the dark. Animals, carriages, vendors shouting late into the evening. Country life had its own soundtrack: crickets, roosters, dogs, and the constant wind. Silence, true silence, was rare. People accepted interruption as normal. Sleep was something fluid, something that came and went. There was no anxiety about it, no counting hours, no talk of insomnia. If you woke, you simply did something quiet until sleep returned. In monasteries, sleep was even more structured. Monks rose at fixed hours to pray. Matins and lauds were sung in the dark hours before dawn. Their sleep was broken deliberately, seen as discipline. Rest was a privilege, not a right. And yet, despite the cold and the discomfort, people found warmth in closeness. In a single room, a family's breathing would fill the air, their bodies heating the space just enough. The bed wasn't just for sleep, it was where life happened. Children were born there. The sick were tended there. The dying took their last breaths there. For centuries, the bed was the center of existence, the physical heart of a home. If we could travel back, step quietly into one of those darkened cottages, you'd see a glow from a hearth, a single candle guttering near the wall, and the shapes of people bundled together beneath rough blankets. A mother humming softly. A child shifting in their sleep. The smell of straw, smoke, and humanity mingling in the air. No silence, no privacy. But maybe, in a strange way, a deeper connection than most of us have ever felt. Even the idea of bedtime was different. It wasn't a strict hour, but a gradual fading of activity. As candles burned low and firewood ran out, people simply stopped. The day ended because light ended. Time itself was slower, measured by the sun, not by clocks. And when people dreamed, they believed those dreams meant something. Dreams weren't random images. They were messages, from God, ancestors, or the beyond. Dream interpretation was a common skill. Entire medieval dream books existed, explaining what it meant if you dreamed of water, or fire, or teeth. People took dreams seriously. They could guide decisions, reveal guilt, even predict death. In a world ruled by uncertainty, dreams were one of the few ways ordinary people felt they could glimpse the unseen. Not all dreams were peaceful. Remember, this was a time of constant fear. Nightmares were often interpreted as demonic visitations. The phrase nightmare itself comes from Mara, an old word for a supernatural being that sat on a sleeper's chest and suffocated them. People described waking in the dark, unable to move, feeling a crushing weight on their chest, what we now call sleep paralysis. But to them, it was real. A demon. A witch. The dead come to visit. Priests were sometimes called to bless the bed, or sprinkle holy water before sleep. Children were taught to cross themselves before lying down, not just for piety, but protection. The night was full of dangers, even inside your home. And yet, there was beauty in it too. The stars were brighter then, a sky untouched by light pollution. People could look up and actually see the Milky Way stretching across the heavens. Night wasn't only fear. It was wonder. Imagine lying on your straw mattress, the air cold, the roof creaking, and above you, through cracks in the wood, the stars watching. You don't need to imagine gods, they're right there, written in the sky. By the 18th and 19th centuries, everything began to change. Industrialization lengthened the day. Candles gave way to oil lamps, then gaslight. Suddenly, people could stay awake longer. The first sleep and second sleep pattern began to fade. The night was no longer divided, it was conquered. Beds became more standardized, cleaner, more private. Bedrooms were designed for individuals, not families. And sleep became a personal act instead of a shared one. The world grew brighter, cleaner, lonelier. We lost something, maybe. That strange intimacy of sharing warmth, of sleeping by the rhythm of the dark. Of waking in the middle of the night not to scroll or check a clock, but simply to exist in the quiet. So the next time you lie down, in your soft bed with your electric light and digital alarm, think about them, the millions who came before, sleeping on straw, wrapped in wool, huddled close. They feared the dark, but they also understood it better than we do. They slept differently, but maybe, just maybe, they dreamed the same way we do. Hey everyone, welcome back. If you're still awake, congratulations. You've made it this far through the night. By now, the candle is probably low, the world outside a little quieter, and we've drifted from the practical dangers of darkness into the more mysterious ones, the ones that live in the mind. Because before there were electric lights, before sleep science, there were dreams. And dreams were serious business. In the centuries before psychology, the line between waking and dreaming was blurry. People believed that the moment you closed your eyes, your soul went wandering. Sometimes it visited the divine. Sometimes, unfortunately, it wandered into darker neighborhoods. Dreams were doors. And not everyone was sure they wanted them opened. In ancient Mesopotamia, dream interpreters, called baru, were considered part priests, part diviners. They catalogued dreams in long clay tablets, recording what each vision meant. Dreaming of a river? That might mean purification. Dreaming of fire? a warning of wrath or destruction. The Egyptians believed the gods used dreams to speak directly to mortals. They even built dream temples where people could sleep overnight, hoping for divine messages. You'd offer incense, lie down on a sacred mat, and wait for your visitation. The dreams were later translated by temple priests, who conveniently charged for the service. Naturally, the Greeks took things a little further. Aristotle and Hippocrates tried to explain dreams scientifically, though their science was mostly guesswork with a philosophical accent. Aristotle thought dreams were caused by digestion, leftover food vapors rising up to the brain. Hippocrates suspected that dreams reflected bodily health. If you dreamed of clear water, your body was balanced. If you dreamed of mud or decay, you were sick. So if you ate something strange before bed and dreamed of chaos, you could just blame dinner. Medieval Europe, of course, wrapped everything in theology. Dreams could be divine revelations or demonic tricks. It was never clear which. Monks and theologians warned that Satan could disguise himself in dreams, planting temptations or false visions. If you dreamed of pleasure, luxury, or, heaven forbid, romantic affection, you were told to confess it at once. But the people ignored the warnings. They kept their dream books anyway. By the 14th and 15th centuries, dream manuals were bestsellers, or at least as best-selling as anything could be when books were handwritten. These manuals translated images into meanings. A dog in your dream meant loyalty. A snake meant deceit. A wedding meant trouble. A tooth falling out meant death. And, strangely, that one survived for centuries. People loved these interpretations. They were comforting. In a world where so much was unpredictable, famine, plague, war, the idea that dreams carried messages made the night feel less random. You weren't powerless while you slept. You were communicating with something larger. Now, not every dream was welcome. Some were terrifying, vivid, paralyzing, suffocating. And people needed an explanation. That's where the nightmare comes in. The word itself goes back to the Old English mare, a demonic being believed to sit on the sleeper's chest. It caused choking, pressure, and dread, the sensations we now associate with sleep paralysis. The phenomenon is ancient. The explanations just evolved. In Scandinavia, the Mara was a ghostly woman, sometimes beautiful, sometimes monstrous, who would ride sleeping men like horses through the night. In Germany, she was the Nachtmar. In Slavic lands, the Mora. The pattern was the same. The figure visited the vulnerable, especially those who slept alone or without spiritual protection. In parts of Africa, similar entities existed, witches or spirits who pressed the chest, stealing one's breath. In Japan, it was kanashibari, a word meaning bound in metal, the feeling of being frozen in place. In every culture, the experience was known. The fear was universal. Imagine waking in a world with no science, no electricity, and no understanding of REM cycles. The fire's gone out. You can't move. You feel something heavy on your chest, and you can't breathe. Wouldn't you believe in demons too? People fought back the only way they knew how, with ritual. Beds were blessed with holy water. Crosses were hung on walls or carved into headboards. Children were taught prayers to say before sleeping. "If I die before I wake," wasn't a poetic flourish. It was genuine fear of not making it to morning. In some places, people scattered iron nails under the bed to ward off spirits. Iron was thought to repel demons, witches, and fairies. Others left bread or salt near the doorway to confuse malevolent beings. In the countryside, charms were common: a sprig of rosemary for remembrance, lavender for peace, or St. John's wort to drive away evil. Amulets were placed under pillows. Some even slept with knives nearby, not for burglars, but for spirits. The idea was to create a fortress of comfort in a dangerous, invisible world. And then there were the omens. Dreams could predict birth, death, or disaster. A woman dreaming of water was said to be pregnant. A man dreaming of falling was warned of sin. A soldier dreaming of broken weapons might never return from battle. It's easy to scoff at those beliefs now, but they came from experience. People noticed patterns. When you live close to death, you start seeing it everywhere. In signs, shadows, and yes, in dreams. During plagues, entire towns claimed to have prophetic visions before outbreaks. In some cases, dreams even influenced politics. King Henry I of England reportedly dreamed of his father warning him about a cursed crown. The next morning, he delayed his coronation, just in case. Even more curious were the dreams of the saints. Hagiographies, the biographies of holy figures, are full of nighttime visions. Angels appeared with glowing faces. Demons whispered temptations. Christ himself arrived to test faith. Sleep wasn't rest. It was a spiritual battleground. In monasteries, monks recorded their dreams as part of their confessions. The line between imagination and sin was blurry. Dreaming about food could indicate gluttony. Dreaming about comfort, pride. Dreaming about desire, you can guess the lecture that followed. It's easy to forget how much guilt and fear were attached to the act of dreaming. Even rest had to be regulated. Outside the monasteries, though, the tone was different. Ordinary people found meaning in their dreams, and often comfort. In one 17th-century English diary, a farmer wrote that he dreamed his deceased wife stood beside his bed, silent but smiling. The next day, he reported feeling peace for the first time in months. Dreams connected people to the dead. When you couldn't afford candles, or a priest, or even a grave marker, you could still talk to your loved ones in sleep. It was, in its way, an equalizer. Of course, not all nighttime visions were comforting. Sleepwalking, for instance, was terrifying to witness. Without electric light, a sleepwalker moving through the dark looked almost supernatural. Pale face, open eyes, silent steps, people often thought they were seeing a ghost. Medical explanations didn't arrive until the 19th century. Before that, the blame went to spirits, the moon, or even bad air. The moon, in particular, got a lot of attention. The word lunatic literally means moonstruck. People believed moonlight could drive a person to madness or cause them to wander. It's ironic, the same moon that guided travelers and inspired poets was also feared for its influence on fragile minds. Dreams, nightmares, and moonlight all blurred together in one continuous mystery. Night was a time of transformation. That's why so many old folk tales take place after sunset. The witching hour. The dead walking. The banshee's cry. The wolf's howl. People filled the dark with stories to make sense of what they couldn't see or control. Storytelling, in a way, was the world's first nightlight. You told tales to make children sleep, to explain thunder, to soothe fear. And in doing so, you made the unknown feel a little smaller. By the Enlightenment, some thinkers started to question the old dream beliefs. Maybe it wasn't spirits, they suggested. Maybe it was just the brain doing whatever the brain does. Descartes, always a party ruiner, claimed dreams proved nothing could be trusted, that we might all just be dreaming, even when awake. Later philosophers debated whether dreams had meaning at all. The theologians panicked briefly, then moved on to other heresies. But ordinary people didn't stop believing. Even in the 19th century, dream dictionaries sold well. Superstitions lingered. Farmers checked dreams before planting. Seafarers took omens from them before voyages. The night, however tamed, remained magical. And honestly, can you blame them? Even now, with all our science, we still dream of flying, falling, of people we miss, of things we never lived but somehow remember. The old fears are still in there, just quieter. The nightmare still visits, only now we give it Latin names and study it under fluorescent light. We still wake in the dark, disoriented, heart-pounding, unsure where we are, just as someone did 1,000 years ago, in a cottage lit by embers, whispering a prayer into the night. Maybe we've never really escaped the old world. We've just replaced candles with screens. So as you drift tonight, if you dream of strange things, of rivers, fire, lost friends, don't worry too much about what it means. Just know that for thousands of years, people have seen the same visions, felt the same fears, and woken to the same quiet darkness. The night is old. And it remembers. If you were alive back then, what would you have thought dreams meant? A message, or just the mind playing tricks? Let me know in the comments when you wake up, or if you're still awake now. Hey everyone! Welcome back, and thank you for walking with me through the long road of darkness. You've traveled from smoky medieval taverns to candlelit courts, from haunted alleys to moonlit fields, and now we reach the last chapter. The part where night itself begins to die. Because somewhere in the 19th century, humanity decided that darkness was an enemy we could finally conquer. And for the first time in our history, we began to live in a world that never truly sleeps. It started with fire, as always. For thousands of years, we'd used torches, rushlights, and candles to push back the dark, one trembling flame at a time. But those were fragile victories, small, flickering defenses against an infinite night. Then came oil lamps, filling city streets with their smoky orange glow. They were messy, but revolutionary. By the 1700s, Paris had over 5,000 oil lamps, each carefully lit by lamplighters before dusk. People began calling it the City of Light. It was the first place on Earth where darkness didn't rule. And for the first time, night became public again, a stage for strolling, for flirting, for commerce. The world discovered what it meant to be illuminated. But that was just the beginning. Because by the 1800s, humanity invented something truly terrifying: control over light itself. When gas lighting arrived, it spread faster than any belief system, any empire, any language. In 1807, London lit its first public gas lamps along Pall Mall. Crowds gathered to watch the miracle, pale flames hissing from pipes hidden under the street. Within decades, every major city followed. Lamps stood in straight lines, their light stretching into infinity, taming the night one street at a time. The air smelled faintly of coal and progress. People began to walk after dark without fear. Shopkeepers stayed open longer. The boundary between day and night started to blur. And then, one night in 1879, the boundary vanished completely. Thomas Edison's light bulb wasn't just an invention. It was a turning point in human consciousness. Before him, we lived in rhythm with the sun, sleeping and waking by its rule. After him, the sun became optional. The electric bulb was small, silent, clean, and eternal compared to flame. It didn't flicker, didn't die with a gust of wind. It hummed with invisible power, the heartbeat of a new world. By the early 20th century, whole cities glowed like constellations fallen to earth. New York, London, Berlin, their skylines shimmered with electric veins, glowing through fog and smog alike. We didn't just light our streets, we lit our homes, our theaters, our factories. Night ceased to exist, and something inside us shifted forever. Writers of the time noticed it first. Poets mourned the vanishing stars. Scientists warned that artificial light disrupted sleep. Philosophers wondered if eternal brightness could make people lose touch with mystery itself. The English writer H.G. Wells once called the modern city a luminous mist, dazzling but airless. But no one could stop it. Factories ran 24 hours a day. Trains and ships navigated through the night with electric lamps. Nightlife became a culture: cabarets, cinemas, jazz halls, neon signs buzzing through the dark. Darkness had been a limit, now it was an invitation. The world began to celebrate insomnia. By the mid-20th century, something strange happened. We forgot what true night looked like. Children in big cities grew up without ever seeing the Milky Way. Farmers who once relied on moonlight now used flood lamps that erased it. The moon itself, that ancient clock in the sky, became a decoration. Astronomers called it light pollution. Poets called it the death of darkness. And if you've ever stood under a city sky, you've seen it yourself, the faint orange haze, the endless glow that replaces the stars. It's beautiful in a man-made way, and yet profoundly lonely. We live inside our own artificial dawn, forever chasing brightness. But let's pause here, because it's easy to romanticize the past, to imagine that darkness was poetic or magical. It wasn't. Darkness was dangerous, dirty, and often deadly. It hid disease, violence, and despair. Entire classes of people, the poor, the sick, the enslaved, vanished into it without record. So yes, we killed the night. But we also saved lives doing it. Light gave us medicine. Light gave us safety. Light gave us knowledge. It's just that, in gaining all that, we forgot how to rest. Sleep, once sacred and shared with nature's cycle, became something we squeezed between shifts. Electric light stretched the day beyond its natural borders. We worked longer, partied later, consumed more. And in doing so, we began to lose something ancient, that slow descent into darkness that reminded us we were human, not machines. The 24-hour city became the new normal. Lights burned in office towers long after midnight. Advertisements glowed in colors no sunrise could match. And people began to speak of burnout. A fitting word, isn't it? We replaced the flame with electricity, but we still burn ourselves out just the same. So here we are, in the 21st century, surrounded by light, drowning in it. Street lamps, phones, screens, cars, billboards, everything glows. Even at 3 a.m., the sky above most cities is not black but gray-blue. We have built our own artificial day. But our bodies still remember the old world. Our circadian rhythms, that ancient clock ticking inside us, still crave darkness. Without it, we don't just lose sleep, we lose balance. Doctors now call it circadian disruption. Too much light at night can lead to insomnia, anxiety, even depression. Our eyes, evolved for firelight and moonlight, were never meant for endless glare. It's ironic, isn't it? We conquered the night, only to discover that we need it to stay sane. So every once in a while, maybe it's worth reclaiming a piece of the old darkness. Turn off the lights. Step outside if you can. Let your eyes adjust to the quiet. Look for the faintest stars, the ones barely surviving the modern sky. Listen for the hum of the world when it finally slows down. That silence, that heavy living silence, is the same one our ancestors heard. The same one monks prayed through, sailors feared, and poets worshipped. The night still exists. It's just waiting for us to remember it. In the end, the story of night is the story of us. We began as creatures who feared it. We learned to live in it. We tried to escape it. And now, maybe, we're learning to miss it. Because without darkness, there can be no light. Without sleep, no awakening. Without mystery, no meaning. So tonight, as you lie there, surrounded by the faint hum of electricity, remember that you are part of a lineage, thousands of years long, of humans who have stared into the dark and dreamed. They saw ghosts, gods, and stars. We see pixels and bulbs. But the feeling is the same, that small, eternal wonder of being alive in a world larger than yourself. So close your eyes now. Let the lights fade, even just in your mind. The world outside hums with brightness, but here, for a few quiet minutes, let the night return. Let it be dark. Let it be still. Let it be ancient. And sleep, in the last shadows of the world we once called night. Good night.